Welcome to Reinventing U, a podcast of the Association for Undergraduate Education at Research Universities, which is abbreviated as URU to emphasize the UERU in our name. I'm Steve Dandino, URU Executive Director and Associate Provost at Colorado State University, Fort Collins, Colorado, which has served as host of URU since 2013. URU was founded in 2000 as a Boyer-inspired national consortium and is today comprised of over 140 member institutions and 8 international affiliates, all working to transform undergraduate education as it is organized at research universities, with many aiming to meet what the Boyer 2030 Commission, for its part, called the Equity Excellence Imperative.
And I'm Julia Michaels, Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships at URU. Steve and I are delighted to welcome Steve Gavazzi, Director of the Center for Human Resource Research at The Ohio State University, an interdisciplinary research center that develops survey software and instruments as well as data sets for researchers around the world. Steve recently co-authored an article for ASU's University Design Institute called The Morrill Act 2050, Reinterpreting the Public Research University Compact as Civic Trust in America's Third Century. This piece will be the main topic of our conversation today. Steve also co-authored 2 books with his longtime collaborator, E. Gordon Gee, What's Public About Public Higher Ed, and Land-Grant Universities for the Future, Higher Education for the Public Good. A marriage and family therapist by training, Steve is also professor in the College of Education and Human Ecology at Ohio State. Steve received his bachelor's at Penn State and his PhD from the University of Connecticut. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much, Julie and Steve.
All right, let's start by giving our audience a quick overview of your piece on the Morrill Act 250, which you co-authored with David Rosowski and Gordon Gee. Why did you write this piece? Why now? And what are some of the core pillars of your argument?
Sure. So we wrote this piece largely in response to the fact that the United States is approaching its 250th anniversary, hence the 250 in the title of Morrill Act 250. And really, the three of us felt that this was a moment when confidence in all public institutions, but especially universities, is no longer a given, the way that it once was, I think. Historically, the land grant system in particular has evolved, I think, well, actually began during a period of great disruption in terms of the American Civil War. The Morrill Act was actually passed in 1862. And so fast forward to today, and we feel like we're really facing a convergence of crises and opportunities again. We're seeing a lot of political polarization. We're seeing what is, I think, just the very beginning of AI-driven change, which has resulted in an increase in the digital divide, both in this country and I think around the world. And I think as a result, a lot of this coming together gives us the evidence that there is a much more skeptical public looking at us. So that was the first part of my answer to your question. And then the second piece of this, in terms of the core argument I think that we're making here, is that the land grant compact, and by the way, this is not just for land grants. I think this is really for all publics. And I think in many ways, this certainly could be relevant to private universities who think the same way. But nevertheless, if we focus on the land grant compact, it doesn't need to be rewritten so much as it needs to be reinterpreted. And by that, I mean that the key shift here, I think, that has to happen is that we start to treat civic trust as a core institutional outcome. So we know that universities track lots of things, right? They track enrollment, they track research funding. In fact, that's typically what land grant universities want to brag about more than anything else. We think that they should also be measuring and demonstrating public trust through very visible practices, through accountability, and most importantly, through the gathering of data on trust.
Well, we're doing this interview with you, Steve, during the week when Yale University's committee put out a report, as I'm sure you're aware, on public trust. And Let's hone in on this a little bit more and dig into it because it is such a broadly discussed topic. You and your co-authors, if I could just quote you briefly, you write, the land grant compact, which you're just describing, does not need to be rewritten so much as recast for the next generation in ways the public can clearly see, understand, and trust. So let's talk a little bit more about this recasting of the historic land grant compact. Could you maybe say a little bit more about what are the finer points that it will resonate with a public which is no doubt very skeptical about
Sure.
public
Oh,
institutions?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that in large part, the reason why I feel very strongly about recasting the mission is that the way that universities earn legitimacy has changed. It used to be that it was just a given. Historically, trust was built through expanding access and demonstrating expertise in a world where both were in scarce supply. But today we have the exact opposite problem, Steve. We have information abundance, but unfortunately, we have scarcity of trust. So I think that means then the mission statements aren't enough. Universities have to show their work in ways that the public can understand, right? You got a smile out of you there. So I think, again, though, to be clear, recasting keeps the same non-negotiables from that happened at the outset. We have to have a public purpose. We have to have broad access. We have to be the people who provide a practical education. But we have to update how those core principles are expressed. So when we say access, now what we mean is digital connectivity. And here at Ohio State, we're trying to lead the way with AI fluency. Practical education. Well, it includes preparing students for nonlinear careers. And public purpose, I think, then requires transparency and continuous engagement with the public. It's never going to ever be a one and done. It's going to have to be a continuous feedback cycle.
All right, let me follow up quickly since I think that would make sense. When you say show your work, which is great, a phrase, by the way, that's going to be very memorable. How is it different from just good public relations, which can become part of the problem rather than really solving the, issue of building genuine, authentic trust between people and an institution?
So I'm going to give you the first example that popped into my head. So there was a major difference that happened when universities first started to talk about community engagement. And there was something that's still known as the Carnegie classification. And people who thought that they were engaged universities wrote this glowing 100-page report on how awesome they were in engagement, right? Okay. And that still is pretty much the way that you get that stamp of approval. However, what APLU, the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, did at least 10 years ago, it might be more than that now, they came up with something called the Innovation and IEP, Innovation and Economic Prosperity Designation, IEP. And what they required was not just this glowing report about what you said that you did. You had to actually show your work. You had to actually get letters from the people that you were working with that said, hey, these folks are really doing the things that they say that they're doing. So I think that's a really concrete example of what I'm saying here. It can't just be PR, because it would just be us writing a 100-page report about how awesome we were. Instead, we have to come up with ways in which we can clearly hear the voices of the public and report that back in a way in which everyone understands it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Thanks.
So, Steve, when we were preparing to record this podcast, you mentioned some of the research that your center had done on public trust in higher education. And you found that the weakest dimension of public trust is confidence in the political neutrality of the classroom. And I wanted to kind of push back at the idea that political neutrality should even be the goal. And I say this because we tend to think that being neutral and objective is good, but on the one hand, you've got some education scholars. I'll just name Paulo Freire, for example, who's argued that teaching should be an inherently political act and that remaining neutral isn't possible. And then on the other side, you've got a lot of pushback. For example, most recently, the Government Accountability Office just put something out on this. You can't, stifle. You have to give equal time in the classroom. And so, I wonder if the public is right that classrooms aren't neutral spaces, but should they be, and why?
Okay, so first of all, thanks for the question. It is a good one, but I'm so strength-based. I have to say to your audience the other side of this. So first of all, let's give great props for universities getting high marks from the public in terms of trust to provide a good education. So first of all, that helps me to also introduce the topic here that trust is multidimensional. So it's not just one thing. And so here's where we're actually explaining that on the one hand, the public trusts universities by and large. It's like upwards of 80% of people believe that colleges and universities are providing a good education. But now, as you said, now I'm going to get to the more problem-based question that you asked, which is, okay, less than 30% of the public trusts us to have a value-free classroom. So I want to now that I've said that, I want to make an important distinction. At least I want to point out that our paper makes an important distinction here. We're not arguing that education can or should avoid politics or difficult topics. What our research shows is that perceptions of classroom neutrality are one of the weakest areas of public trust. So the issue isn't whether neutrality is philosophically possible, it's whether the process feels fair to people. That's how we're reading it. So what that means, I think, how do we translate that? Transparency in syllabi, exposure to multiple perspectives, clear norms around evidence and how to engage in discourse. So and again, I'll try to wrap up the answer here. I'm certainly happy to go into more, but in our framework, neutrality is less about being apolitical, and it's more about demonstrating procedural fairness so that people trust that universities are expanding judgment, not prescribing conclusions.
I think that's so important to clarify, and I appreciate your answer on this because what you're saying is that it's not that everything should be neutral or that it can, but rather it's the equity of the process, the fairness of the process that really matters.
Yep.
I'm a sociologist, so I always think of Max Weber's observation that students are captive audience, and they have to be there, and so we have to treat them fairly and expose them fairly in a procedural process way to a range of ideas, and in their best interest, looking out for that, privileging that over the particular point of view of an instructor or what have you, right? So I think explaining that to the public does seem like a great way to help recast or reestablish and re-earn, as you put it, that trust that we maybe took for granted in the past.
And let me just piggyback on that then, Steve. So that's why gathering data on this is so important, because again, we're making an assumption, we're making a hypothesis that if we start to push out that kind of information, that the public might say, okay, look, Colorado State University is interested in doing that. And yet, if we gathered that data 6 months from now, and we didn't move the needle at all, we could still then say, all right, it's got to be more than just saying that this is the process, right? Like that's where that data gathering and why it has to be longitudinal research, that's why it comes in. And in fact, that's something else, if you don't mind me just riffing off of that for just a moment. One of the things that's really different about the research that we did is that it is longitudinal. And in fact, that's what we're really promoting, is a very strong longitudinal research perspective on this. Why? Because one of the things that we found that happened in our work was that people changed their political identities between our two data collection points. So we started the first round of data that we did was in the early months of the Biden administration in 2021, and then fast forward, the second data collection was in the early months of the second Trump administration, and almost 30% of people changed their political affiliation from time one to time two. Now, that actually also mattered, and maybe we can dive into that. But the reason I'm bringing it up here is this runs counter to what we see in big polls like Gallup and Pew and others that are out there that are always reporting on, well, Democrats think this and Republicans think this. The problem is they're all doing cross-sectional research. So my question back to the people at Gallup and Pew is, how do you know that those people who you're reporting as Democrats now weren't independents or Republicans the last time that you collected data? And so the political fluidity, the fluidity of political identity is one of those really important variables that has to get picked up in this kind of work.
Yeah, that's critically important. I'm trying to think of this as as a social scientist like yourself. Uh, Let me ask you a question about civics education generally, but maybe more about who the people are. In your paper, you stress the importance of the university's connection as a democratic institution with the people, so to speak.
With a small d.
Yeah, right, exactly. Small d
Small d
democracy.
democratic,
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. Stemming from its origins with Republican President Lincoln signing that
That's right.
legislation. So the one issue I have, or at least a question I have about that grounding is sometimes the people, as your own research shows, who are least informed about how civics works or how government works, how societies work, are the folks who are most skeptical of universities, and the vice versa. Those who are very informed tend to support civics education, kind of understand a little bit better the meaning behind things, the why, and therefore are able to enter into the ambiguities of education and accept them more readily, and the like. And I'm thinking of how we all know faculty and students on our campuses, public university campuses, sometimes they'll be pursuing knowledge for its own sake, or they'll go into territory that's quite controversial, very opaque. No, there's no clear connection at all to the people's interests or to the issues of the day and the like. And so therefore it's very foreign feeling and sounding to a large segment of the people. So if we're grounding our legitimacy in that democratic basis, but yet we're often kind of off in the wilderness, but for ultimately good reason, to protect that freedom of inquiry and to explore new knowledge and new boundaries and push boundaries and engage in criticism, all that. How do you square that circle that allows for the legitimacy, the democratic legitimacy, but then also you might call it the liberal freedom of the individual to express and do as they wish?
Yeah. So first of all, you painted the picture really well of the dynamic tension that exists there. So I think that first of all, we have to recognize that, and I think that part of it is then. What is it that you do? The question really becomes, what do you do with that dynamic tension? And I think we cover this to some degree in the paper, but I want to now be careful and say that what I'm about to say may not be a reflection of what President Gee or Dr. Rosofsky thinks. So, but I do think that the answer to this issue is capacity building. So here, what I'm saying is that civics education should emphasize how institutions work and how to evaluate evidence, and then how to engage across the differences that you find. So importantly, I think that civics education has to be embedded into the curriculum. And I should say it actually differently, across the curriculum, not isolated in ways that begin to then feel ideological. So now, saying that, I can say that in the paper, we frame that as part of rebuilding civic trust. In other words, teaching students not what to think, but how to participate effectively in a democratic society.
So, one of the core suggestions in the blueprint that you articulate in this piece is that leaders get much more transparent about their data. But we know that when you publish data, there's the possibility that it will be used against you. Do you have any thoughts for leaders on how to avoid this weaponization of their own data, or is it simply a risk that's worth taking if it means we can regain public trust?
Yeah, well, I'm a big data guy, so the answer is that you have to have that data. But I do want to say something about that, and I, a lot of times when I'm talking to university leaders, I do recognize that people don't want to ask questions that they don't want to hear the answers to, and I think that that's a luxury statement, because if a university leader at this point actually was bold enough to say, I don't want to see data on trust, then they probably shouldn't be in that job. So now, saying that, I do think that there are risks to this, but I think they're front end risks. And what I mean by that is, I think that if you're truly interested in gathering data on trust, then you're probably invested in wanting to do something about that. And so therefore, your worst score is going to be the first one. But the good news here is if you're working at it, then that data is actually going to continue to be gathered and you're going to show improvements over time. So I think that's the short answer, but let me just riff off of that for a second, because it made me think of something else from the paper. If universities don't provide that kind of clear and contextualized data, somebody else is going to do that. Nature abhors a vacuum. And unfortunately, if universities aren't doing it, my bet is it tends to be that it will be oversimplified and distorted. And that's actually something that we call the broad brush problem that we mention in this paper, but we also have a full other paper on what we call the broad brush dilemma. And so this is the danger of not gathering this kind of information. So at the end of the day, what is it that we recommend? Standardized, publicly accessible dashboards, especially around trust. And they have to be paired with really clear explanations of what the data means, but also what the data does not mean. And then I think over time, that kind of consistent transparency becomes a trust building practice in and of itself.
I'm reminded that President McGinnis at Yale, who's the product of a public university education and former president at Stony Brook before going to Yale, she obviously has the courage to confront this problem head on, having impaneled that faculty committee and supported their recommendations. And I assume now will engage in, who knows how much public discussion using their platform to promote thinking about this issue. So I wanted to pivot just a little bit to one of the many, many challenges in our environment that's driving a lot of change in universities, and not just at universities. We have the climate emergency, we have threats to democracy worldwide, and any number of other issues. But one that I think everyone's talking so much about now is artificial intelligence and how it will impact education, higher education, and work and all facets of life. It's a potentially very transformative technology, as we all know. And in your paper, in the report, you address it and you call for AI fluency as a baseline competency. And of course, your university, the Ohio State University, which we're looking forward to visit here in June and excited to be on campus in Columbus, is one of the leading institutions in this area and recognized nationally for that through the AI Fluency Initiative. And without, minimizing in any way the importance of timely skill acquisition in this area and then others, how can we as educators also, though, incorporate into our strategy for dealing with this new technology, understanding of and education around the growing concerns that have to do with, there's many, and I'll just tick off a few: unregulated AI development that has an ecological impact, the impact on jobs, of course, which we hear more and more about, where the concern is that intellectual work will be automated or, eliminated. Positions, entry level and otherwise, for knowledge creators will be eliminated, and even the impact, of course, directly on education itself. How it's affecting the classroom and what it means to be engaged in higher education, and on and on. International affairs, bad actors, and the like. And we all have a direct interest in that. So, without going on too much about the vast and rapidly changing landscape around AI thinking, maybe could you maybe say a little bit about how you think universities should respond, say specifically with respect to career pathways, which are for which we're preparing students, but which seem to be quickly being dismantled right before our eyes.
There's so many different things I could pick up on. I'm gonna stick with what pops into my head first in terms of one of the metaphor shifts that we talk about in the paper, which is, I think, again, if you buy into the notion that historically universities have kind of taken the role of porter, if you will. And by that, what I mean is that we were there at the front door. We asked the student to pick a major. And then we said, oh, that's what you want to do. Here's this lockstep way of getting to become an expert in that degree. And then at the end, we just simply assumed that we did our jobs. They were fully trained in that major, and that major would give them the job that they wanted or needed, right? What we're saying now, and again, I'm sticking especially to the AI disruption that we're seeing, is that we can't be porters anymore. We have to be navigators. And we use that metaphor in the paper because we're realizing that students cannot be prepared for a single career path anymore, but instead it's going to be a continuous adaptation to the AI-shaped world. So again, back to AI fluency, it becomes one of those baseline skills alongside other really human capacities and capabilities like judgment, ethics, collaboration, team building, problem framing, right? Those are the kinds of things that will necessarily exist alongside of AI. But again, I'm at risk here of making this sound so vocational, and I don't want to just focus on workforce preparation, because I think AI raises civics questions too, about governance and ethics and societal impact, right? So if universities have a responsibility, I should say, so universities do then have a responsibility to help both students and the broader public to navigate not just what AI can do, but what AI should do. And that's actually interestingly reflected in a survey that we are deploying literally right now. We're in the field deploying a survey on AI perceptions. And I won't get into this rabbit hole, but we're doing an experiment inside of this where we're doing a classic survey where there are some open-ended questions alongside more quantitative-oriented questions. And we're doing that with half the sample. And then in the other half of the sample, we're actually using an AI tool called cognitive interviewing to see whether or not we actually get more better information about people's perceptions of AI. So stay tuned on that. But I think it's going to be a really interesting scholarly exercise once we get that data.
That sounds awesome. What a terrific idea. And I don't think this, to me, just from my point of view, I don't think it's overly, career related kind of conversation. In fact, what I hear you saying is that our responsibility is to double down on the qualities that come from a liberal arts and science education. And you mentioned judgment and, broader contextualization skills and literacy of all varieties, and so it may be that this technology causes us to, return to some very traditional educational values and practices and inculcate them all the more so in the students who come to us. Thought
Right.
about that? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I want to put in a plug for the arts and humanities here, because I think in an AI world, arts and humanities are going to become ever more important as the balance, the counterbalance, if you will, to the AI world. And again, there's another survey that we're going to be deploying in a month or so, in which we're going to be looking at history and the humanities here in the state of Ohio and asking questions, which would include some of those perceptions of the public about what is the role of humanities in terms of being that balance or counterbalance to AI.
Well, Steve, I think that's a good place to end. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us that we haven't covered already?
So I guess the only other thing that I'd like to talk about for your audience is that we have worked on a model. We call it the radar model, that helps universities to gather this kind of information. And radar just simply stands for, the R is recognize, and that means recognizing emerging signals from the data that you gather. The A is the analyze. What that means is you're looking for patterns and trends. The D part is the diagnosis. So this is, what are the implications of those trends for institutional priorities and policies? And then the second A is act, so that, you gathered all this data, what are you going to do with it? So acting on the insights through what we talk about as proactive strategies. And then R, the last R, is the review. By that, I mean reviewing outcomes and recalibrating your university system in a way that would ensure continuous improvement. And again, this is for all universities. This is just not a land grant thing. This is, all universities should be adopting some sort of model like that, where they're using that data as part of a continuous improvement cycle, except this is a continuous improving trust cycle. Because I think at the end of the day, that's what we really see. So, but I do want to end on a little bit of a land grant note here, if I can. So at its core, that paper that we wrote, Morrill Act 250, is asking one simple but very important question. What would it look like if universities treated trust as something that they actively build, measure, and report, just like any other core outcome that they have? And we want to keep posing that question, because in today's environment, legitimacy is not inherited, it's earned. So how do you earn it? Continuous listening, visible action, and results that the public can recognize as their own. Because at the end of the day, we are the people's universities.
Bravo. Thank you, Steve. We so appreciate you joining us today. I encourage everyone to read the piece, Morrill Act 250. We'll put the link in our notes for today's conversation. URU members can log into My URU to hear 2 additional questions and some concluding discussion for UVPs and their colleagues. For now, though, thanks to listeners of Reinventing U, a podcast of the Association for Undergraduate Education at Research Universities, or URU. Reinventing You is available on our website, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about URU, check us out at ueru.org.
We didn't go over that before we began, Steve, but we do this couple of last questions here for the insiders, you know.
I love that. That's a great idea. We
probably stole it from someone. I forget, you know.
No, stealing that's great. That's the most sincere form of flattery. We do the same thing with our advancement development people. It's like, you can come see the lecture, but hey, if you want to talk to the presenter, bring your checkbook and you can come talk to him backstage.
You got it. That's for sure. When you were explaining radar just now, I was thinking Dewey would like that. I think, it has this great pragmatic feel to it, what you're describing, the entire paper. And of course, we don't have to get into that, but I just think it makes a lot of sense. And I really applaud what you and Gordon and your other author, forgive me, have done. It's impressive. So just a quick question about the partisan gap issue, which, is talked a lot about. And, some people question whether it's real, and you've already spoken to it. a little bit. Could you maybe just say a little bit more about how your research shines a particular light on that question, and maybe also in the spirit of this pragmatic approach, what is there anything more we need to know about what to do about it, like how to address it as a problem?
So I think the most important thing to say is that our data does suggest that the trust gap is real, but it's also more fluid than people assume. So we found in that study significant shifts in political affiliation over a relatively short period of time, which means, I think, that static partisan categories don't fully explain trust dynamics. And that's why we emphasize continuous listening through tools like longitudinal panels and the radar framework that we've already talked about. So I think what matters most across shifting identities are the consistent signals. And we've talked about some of them: fairness, transparency, responsiveness. I think those are the anchors of trust in this very volatile environment that we're in right now.
It's like you're saying we're makers of culture. We're playing a active role in cultivating democratic culture, and we have to make that very intentional, have a process for doing it, monitor it, all that, to be more self-aware of our generative role, and not just depend on received cultural value and assets, from right? Is that a
Yep.
fair kind of summary of the
Yep.
basic? Okay, thank you. It's a really, I'm a sociologist, yet I feel like I maybe missed this. And so I really feel, I'm learning something very important here, a reminder of an important lesson, that we need reminding of, I think.
Well, I'm a family therapist by training, but I'm surrounded by sociologists. So maybe that's some of where
Oh,
that
I'm
connection.
sorry for you, Steve. Sorry.
One last question for you, Steve. When you talk about the knowledge dimensions of trust, whose knowledge counts? For example, it took 100 years for tribal institutions to be included in Morrill. So whose knowledge is being centered in your blueprint? And to put it bluntly, what if we're wrong about whose knowledge or whose stories, as a qualitative researcher might put it, will matter the most in the future?
That's, Julie, that it's a central concern. It is, you've hit it right on the mark, especially given the history of delayed inclusion in the land grant system, right? So we saw this 60 some year delay before historically Black colleges and universities were brought into the fold. And then 80 some years later before we got the tribal colleges in. And by no means are they all fairly treated. So that needs to be said too. But if I stick with the paper for a second, when what we're emphasizing in there is co-governance. So that means co-governed accountability. So what that means is universities themselves don't define success on their own. So that means who's doing this then? Communities, partners, other stakeholders. They're the ones who have to help determine what outcomes matter, which then means what indicators are meaningful, which means what results or how the results are interpreted. So I want to say something else about that too, because what I think you're pointing to is part of what we're saying in terms of the distinction we make between inclusion and validation. In a university setting, everyone's voice can be heard in the sense that we don't preemptively exclude people from participating in dialogue, but not every claim is given equal standing, right? Universities have an obligation to uphold standards of evidence, scholarship, and truth-seeking. So pick your whatever case you want in terms of things that are really out on the fringe. Those issues, and talking about those issues, that doesn't mean that we're including that different perspective. It's actually taking that perspective in and then, where appropriate, rejecting the claims that are demonstrably false and contradicted by overwhelming evidence, historical or otherwise. So we're not advocating giving any claim equal footing, because that wouldn't be openness. It would be a failure of academic responsibility. So I'll wrap up here. What does count, I think, is engaging people, understanding where distrust or misinformation comes from, and then responding with the evidence, clarity, and rigor that we have. That's how universities balance openness with integrity. So voices can be heard, but ideas still have to meet standards. And that, I think, is the distinction in terms of building real trust. Now, saying all of that, like you said, going 15, 20 years down the road and we find additional evidence that tell us something that we claimed was wrong, that's also part of the scientific process. And that does belong inside of the history of universities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve, for being with us today.